This video considers the depiction of the sublime in Frankenstein. Mary Shelley's novel evinces her deep familiarity with the theories of the sublime that were current in her day. In particular, Frankenstein demonstrates Shelley's interest in using the creature to problematize Kant's idea of the sublime, which, as I discussed in the last video, ultimately reinforces received Western ideas of the human. Repeatedly in Frankenstein, Victor reveals his deep investment in the Kantian sublime. In other words, he often comes across examples of the sublime in nature and, after initially being humbled by their grandeur, goes on to rise up and assert his own supremacy as a human over the natural world. Victor's investment in the Kantian sublime isn't surprising, since he conforms to the traditional humanist and Enlightenment stress on men doing amazing things with their brains. After all, Victor aspired to use his reason to do the ultimate, create another human being. However, Shelley doesn't allow Victor to enjoy the Kantian sublime. Instead, she portrays Victor's efforts being cut off by the sudden appearance of the creature. A good example of this pattern at work in Frankenstein appears in the second chapter of Book 2. At this point in the narrative, devastated by the death of William and the execution of Justine, Victor and his family have retreated from their home in Geneva, Switzerland, to their country house in Bellerive on the eastern shore of Lake Geneva. In a romanticist manner, Chapter 1 dwells a great deal upon the complex and difficult feelings of both Victor and his family. Worried about Victor's mental and emotional state, his father suggests a family hiking trip to the resort town of Chamonix, a site in the Alps that is renowned, as Victor stresses, for its sublime scenery. A depressed Victor sets out alone on a gloomy and rainy morning to hike to Glacier Montanvert. Victor explains that he hoped the journey would make him feel better, because during past hikes to that glacier, he experienced the sublimity of the, quote, tremendous and ever-moving glacier, end quote, which imbued him with what we can identify as the Kantian sublime. As he puts it to Walton, in the past, visits to the glacier, quote, had filled me with a sublime ecstasy that gave wings to the soul and allowed it to soar from the obscure world to light and joy. In other words, the massive glacier prompted Victor's awareness of his own sublimity, as witnessed by his soaring spirit. As he recounts his hike, Victor describes his initial encounter with the sublimity of his natural surroundings, describing the vast mists before him. Remember, sublimity has everything to do with what is vast or immense. Victor then describes the initial, as he puts it, melancholy impression he receives from the objects around him. Alas, why does man boast of sensibilities superior to those apparent in the brute? It only renders them more necessary beings. If our impulses were confined to hunger, thirst, and desire, we might be nearly free. But now we are moved by every wind that blows, and a chance word or scene that word may convey to us. Here, as elsewhere in Frankenstein, Shelley's vocabulary includes words whose meanings rarely, if at all, circulate today. Necessary is one such word. Here it means susceptible to external forces. In other words, vulnerable. Thus, Victor is lamenting here how the supposedly superior sensibilities of man actually make them especially necessary, that is, fragile or vulnerable to the elements, moved, for example, by every wind that blows. Here Victor exemplifies the humbling effect of the sublime. He is aware of human mutability, fragility, the susceptibility of man to outside influence. The sublime surroundings have deflated any idea about the superiority of man. We have what seems to be a post-human moment, in which a humanist and Enlightenment idea of the human has been destabilized. Victor then describes his encounter with Mont Blanc. Victor's description of the scene is dense with adjectives like awful majesty, wonderful, stupendous, and vast that connote the sublime. At this point, Victor begins to experience the shift described by Kant, from an initial destabilization of the self to a reassertion of human sublimity. Victor states, "My heart, which was before sorrowful, now swelled with something like joy. I exclaimed, 'Wandering spirits, if indeed ye wander and do not rest in your narrow beds, allow me this faint happiness, or take me as your companion, away from the joys of life.'" Victor is on the cusp of the resolution of the sublime, as described by Kant. His heart swells, and he senses his union, not with his mere physical environment, but with a higher spiritual world, of which he, as a human, is a part. But then, as Victor puts it, "As I said this, I suddenly beheld the figure of a man at some distance advancing towards me with superhuman speed. He bounded over the crevices in the ice, among which I had walked with caution. His stature also, as he approached, seemed to exceed that of man. I was troubled. A mist came over my eyes, and I felt a faintness seize me. I perceived, as the shape came nearer, sight tremendous and abhorred, that it was the wretch whom I had created. I trembled with rage and horror. He approached. His countenance bespoke bitter anguish, combined with disdain and malignity, while its unearthly ugliness rendered it almost too horrible for human eyes." As Paul Utka, a professor at the University of Kansas, puts it, here as elsewhere in the novel, Frankenstein sets up moments of sublimity for its central male character, only to consistently interrupt the expected Kantian resolution with the arrival of the creature. What does Shelley mean by such interruptions? I would suggest, following Utka, that by introducing the image of the creature alongside the natural sublime, Shelley is encouraging us to compare them to each other. Importantly, while Victor proves capable of asserting himself when confronted by the natural sublime, when he encounters the creature, he is utterly overpowered. A mist comes over his eyes. A faintness seizes him. To begin to unpack this amazing passage, let's recall how abjection works. Victor and other figures like Walton affirm a system involving binaries and hierarchies such as human over nature, mind over matter, soul over body, spiritual over physical, I over body. The creature violates those systems through his physical appearance. As we've seen, for example, his eye doesn't take us beyond his body to his mind, but remains resolutely of the body. And because the abject violates received systems, categories, and boundaries, exposing their status as just that, mere systems, it is tremendously powerful. As Jeffrey Jerome Cohen puts it in his discussion of monstrosity, the abject or monstrous threatens to destroy not just individual members of a society, but the very cultural apparatus through which a society is created. All of which is to say, through the creature's appearance, Shelley engages in post-humanism. She represents an attack on the very idea of the human that Victor and theorists like Kant embrace. Just as Victor anthropocentrically asserts his own sublimity, affirming his superiority over all nature, the creature, so to speak, knocks him off his humanist pedestal. As Utka puts it, the creature promises the destruction of more than just Victor's family and friends. It spells the end of the very structure of their subjectivity. I invite you to write a close reading of this passage for up to 2 points extra credit on the final. Please send your 2-page typed double-spaced paper to me. Some elements of the passage you might consider are: how does the creature, as opposed to Victor, relate to his natural surroundings? How might we interpret the quote-unquote countenance of the creature, which bespoke bitter anguish combined with disdain and malignity? How might we close read the adjective unearthly. How might we close read the stress, yet again, on eyes and vision in the passage?